Hi everyone. In this video we are going to be discussing the agrarian movement. We are going to be analyzing populism, and we are also going to be evaluating the impact of the Populist Party in the United States. When we are finished, you will have the opportunity to analyze the Populist Party through political cartoons. First, let's talk about the problems that farmers faced between 1870 and 1900. So, during this time period, the farmers of the United States experienced agricultural overproduction. That means that when the West was opened for settling, there was an amount of land available for farming that allowed for the overproduction of goods. There was a lot of machinery that had been developed to help farmers, and also there were new techniques that allowed farmers to grow more crops. The access of more crops meant that prices of those crops would fall. Farmers also had a lot of high costs for running their farms. In order to sell their goods, they had to ship them through the railroads across the United States to these markets that were in the East. And at the time, railroads had very unfair practices towards farmers. They forced them to pay whatever wages the railroads felt like charging them, and they monopolized local routes. So there was no competition for lower shipping rates, and farmers had to pay whatever they wanted. And oftentimes, the railroad companies charged more for shorter distances than for long distances. Farmers were also in a lot of debt. They had to borrow money in order to make improvements to their farms or buy new machinery. They also borrowed whenever there was a poor harvest. So if they didn't produce a lot of crops and didn't make enough money from selling their crops that they produced, they had to borrow from the bank, and they often used their farms as security. So if they didn't pay back those loans, the banks could take their farms from them. And the banks often charged them very high interest rates, making it difficult for farmers to pay back their debts, and they often ended up losing their farms. On top of that, between 1870 and 1900, farmers experienced a lot of natural disasters. So they were subject to droughts in the Midwest. There were also a lot of invasions from insects that ruined the crops, and floods. A very bad year could virtually wipe out a family's savings and destroy their livelihood. So farmers got together to form associations to help them through the hard times. And they started the Granger movement in 1867. The purpose of this movement was to form a social club for farmers to help them overcome the isolation of living in these rural areas. So it was kind of like a club where they could come together and meet other farmers and socialize. They also were able to spread information about new farming techniques or machinery that was available. Eventually, though, the Grangers built these cooperatives. So basically, it's like a union or an association of farmers that they bought things in bulk. They bought machinery, fertilizers, and manufactured goods in these large numbers, and they were able to obtain them at lower prices. They also allowed farmers to sell their crops directly to city markets, and unfortunately, a lot of them failed because of the lack of business experience that these leaders had. Thanks to the Granger movement, however, a series of laws were passed to protect farmers. Grangers, because they did vote and have political influence, were able to elect candidates who promised to reform the laws in the Midwestern states. So a lot of state laws were passed that regulated the railroads and the grain storage rates. However, those laws were challenged in the U.S. courts, and the Interstate Commerce Act was eventually passed in favor of the farmers to stop the unfair railroad practices. That was one of the acts that we talked about in the previous unit. The Populist Party emerged from this movement. In 1891, we have a new third party in the United States. This party wanted to represent what they called, quote-unquote, the common man, the farmer, the industrial worker, the miners. And they were up against bankers and also those railroad owners and their interests. Women played a very important role in the Populist Party because they served as speakers and organizers, even though they didn't have any political power and could not vote. So this is the platform of the Populist Party that was presented to the American people in 1892. 1. They wanted the unlimited coinage of silver. They wanted to be able to pay their debts with silver. This would raise farm prices and make loan repayment easier for farmers because there was more silver than gold, as was the standard at the time. They also wanted to elect their senators directly. Before the Populist Party emerged, the state legislatures, that means the state officials, the state senators, the state congressmen, they're the ones who elected the senators that were sent to represent people in the federal government. The Populist Party wanted for people to directly vote for their senators. They wanted to impose term limits for presidents. They wanted to limit the presidential terms to only one term. At this time, there were no limits placed on presidents. The Populist Party also wanted a secret ballot. At this time in the United States, when you cast your ballot, your vote was known. They knew exactly who you voted for. And so voters were often intimidated to vote for other people, or, they were retaliated against because they voted for someone else. So they wanted the secret ballot to protect the voters from intimidation. They also wanted the government to take ownership of the railroads, the telegraphs, and the telephones. They wanted to do that so that the government would ensure that the prices remained affordable for the common man. They fought for a graduated income tax. They wanted to tax the wealthy at a higher rate than those who made less money. They wanted to restrict immigration, so they wanted quotas imposed on certain parts of the world. For example, they would only, the United States would only allow a few hundred Chinese immigrants or Irish immigrants. This way, that would protect the workers who were competing with immigrants for jobs in the factories. And they also fought for a shorter workday. They wanted 8 hours to be the limit that workers were forced to work in factories. Okay, so in 1892, the Populist Party ran for many offices, and they were quite successful in local elections. So they were able to have 5 senators elected to office. They also received over 1 million votes for the presidential candidate. However, they didn't win that presidential election. You can see in the map, the green was the Populist Party candidate. It was a man named Weaver. He won in the states of Kansas, Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada. These areas here are very big rural areas, so lots of support from farmers. The Depression of 1893 hit the United States shortly after this election, and populists were blaming the lack of currency for the Depression, again stating that silver was a better form of currency than gold, and they started demanding that unlimited coinage of silver. So in 1896, they have another major national election, and this time they put William Jennings Bryan on the presidential ticket. He, instead of running as a populist, he ran as a Democrat. So he was the Democratic nominee in 1896, and he got a lot of the support from the Populist Party because if the Populists had nominated their own candidate, it would be hard for anyone to defeat a Republican. So they decided to back William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan is known for a very famous speech called the Cross of Gold speech. In it, he praises farmers and denounces bankers, and this is how he gets the support of the Populist Party. So I want you to look at this document and then think about the following questions. So in 1896, the Democratic Party held its national convention to pick the presidential candidate, and William Jennings Bryan delivered this speech, the Cross of Gold speech, and it was so powerful that he won the nomination. He says, "My friends, the question we are to decide is, upon which side will the Democratic Party fight? Upon the side of the idle holders of idle capital, or upon the side of the struggling masses. That question the party must answer. You tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. So in reading this excerpt from Bryan's speech, which groups did Bryan appeal to in his speech to the Democratic Convention? How did he try to show that farmers were superior to people who lived in cities? Think about that, and we'll discuss it in class. Okay, so William McKinley was the Republican nominee for president in the election of 1896. He was very pro-business. He was pro-rich, pro the wealthy class, and he actually did defeat Bryan, but very, very narrowly. Bryan almost won. Here is a map of the election. So the red represents McKinley, the Republican, and the blue represents Bryan. And you notice there's no third party in this one because the Populist Party backed the Democrat. So McKinley won 51% of the popular vote, and 47% went to the Democratic nominee. So just a very slight margin in this election. Okay, so then let's talk about the election of 1900. This is where Bryan runs again against McKinley. This time, Bryan does lose, and it brings an end to the Populist Party. There are going to be new gold discoveries, which puts an end to the demand for coining silver. The farm prices do increase, and urbanization is going to weaken the national interest in the politics of the Populist Party. So the 1900 brings about the defeat of that third party. Okay, so what is the legacy of populism? They never really got a precedent, so what did they get? The third parties in the United States provide an outlet for minorities to voice their grievances and generate new ideas. And even though it's difficult for third parties to get elected to big political offices like the presidency, in order to appeal to that third party, the big parties, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, are going to find themselves in a pickle. They need to start adopting those ideas that the populists had, or the third parties have, in order to gain their support. So things like the graduated income tax, the direct election of senators, those were adopted by the Democratic Party and eventually became law. That brings us to the end of the lecture. If you guys have any questions, bring them to class, and thank you for watching.